I want to add a footnote, all right, ladies, now, to our discussion about Freud. So if you have notes somewhere and you'd like to include these as a continuation of that discussion, then try to find that place. And
are we done with Nietzsche?
We are done with Nietzsche, yes. So you can put a line at the end of that one. Who did Freud? Who was it? Was it Sidney? Okay, yeah. Well, Sidney's report, he's not here to get this little congratulations, but it was quite good. And so just to highlight some of the things he said, I won't give further explanation because actually he was pretty thorough, but I've got some stuff I want to add to it. But his discussion of the what's called the conscious, the unconscious, and the preconscious are good, and that's kind of classic Freud. The id, the superego, all of that. He explained that pretty well. You should know this is a famous aspect of Freud's thought. It's become part of the jargon of our culture, the Oedipal Complex. You know, and you'll hear that expression just routinely, and it'll be assumed that you know what it is. And so now that you've heard the explanation, you will know if you didn't already. But as you know, in Greek mythology, Oedipus famously killed his father and married his mother. He did it unwittingly. He wasn't aware that's what he was doing till later. But it nevertheless kind of stands for this strange dynamic that sometimes happens in the family life where there's a kind of jealousy. And Freud documented this, and there's some truth to it. I think he overstates it, but then sometimes you have to overstate something before people take it seriously. But the Oedipal Complex then stands for a whole raft of psychological problems, usually sexual in nature, in which, in the ordinary course, it represents men who have not ever quite gotten over some kind of relational problem with their mother. So it can be a much broader set of issues. This is real. And I wish I had more time to kind of go into this in some detail because it can be sort of a helpful thing to realize. For you who are future mothers in the room, you know, if you can remember this for the next 10 years or whatever it is till you are a mother, one of the things a mother has to do is untie apron strings. Many mothers have a hard time doing that. And in a culture where the man tends to be, and has been over the last several years, less visible, I know in your families you probably, as a rule, have fathers who are very much present in your lives, but I know there are exceptions in this room to that. But especially if the father is kind of stepping out of the picture. So you got a distant father and a son who gets overly connected to his mother, and then a mother who becomes overly protective. You get some dimension of this kind of thing going on. And what happens in the long term is a man doesn't grow up. It's called the Peter Pan complex, where a man just stays adolescent and dependent. And I personally am acquainted with guys who are 30, 35 years old who are still dependent on mommy, And that's sad. And to some degree, it's partly mom's fault because mothers can be so concerned about their little boy that even when he's 6 feet tall and weighs 200 pounds, he's still the little boy and still needs to be protected, And that's part of how this Oedipal complex plays out in terms of real life. It's not so much the Oedipus story itself, but it's sort of dimensions of it. And that's what Freud developed, and it I think has been helpful. You may be interested in knowing, and I approach this somewhat cautiously, but a great deal of the pornography in our culture plays to men with an Oedipal complex. there's been a fair amount of psychological, today, of course, pornography is readily available virtually anywhere you turn. The culture you're in compared to the culture I grew up in at your age is unbelievable in the way that it's, sort of developed that. So you are, in some ways, more experienced in just having to deal and sort and filter pornographic stuff, even on, primetime TV, than I ever did at your age. It's just, but it has been established to a high degree of I think, reliable evidence that, for example, say Playboy magazine, which is a different magazine today than it was, say, 20, 30 years ago. But psychologists would look at the images in Playboy magazine, and not all of them, but the primary images, the ones where they would spend hundreds of thousands of, well, I will say tens of thousands of dollars producing images, the fold out in the middle kind of thing. Were about 70 to 80% of the time, those images were intended to create an appearance of a mother nursing, you see, to appeal to men with an Oedipal complex. But it's kind of buried beneath a layer of macho, this is the magazine for men, and it's the magazine for cripples. It's the magazine for sexual cripples. The guy who cannot make it with a real woman in the real world, in a normal relationship, turns to this sick fixation on his mother. But it's kind of set in a sexual context, Now, it's a very interesting thing, and some of you who are interested in psychology and would like to look at that in a more, serious way, I can give you resources. I'm not sure I want to yet, but I can point you at least to resources that might be of interest to you. But what I want to say at this point is that just be aware that's out there, and that's part of how the pornographic industry makes it. It's playing to men who are sexual cripples, And so that's a good warning to all of us men in the room that that's no place for a healthy guy to go. It's not good for you, and in fact it will truly impair, it will impede your own masculinity to get caught in that. But just realize there's a psychology that drives it, and we can thank Freud for kind of highlighting that. He was in some ways the first guy, way before we had this avalanche of pornographic images to deal with. He was the guy that sort of recognized that. So that's one little piece of Freudian psychology that you might be interested in. The flip side of what's called the Oedipal Complex, you don't hear about this nearly as much, but it's called the Electra Complex. Electra was the sister of Oedipus, and there was a kind of a collateral theory of a girl's fixation on her father. That's been less famous. There's something to it, but it doesn't get as much press, and you probably are less likely to have heard of that. Some of the jargon of your culture is thoroughly Freudian. And again, I'm only giving you this because you're seniors and you're going to be dealing with it soon enough in college classrooms. But when you commonly hear somebody said to be anal, you'll hear that expression, oh, that person is really anal. You've heard that. Have you ever heard that? Yeah. Okay. Please help me here. Well, that's Freud. That's a Freudian term. And it's a reference back to what he suggested was a developmental stage of childhood development. And he had the anal stage, the phallic stage, all of these sexual stages, Well, I don't want to develop this except to say that is all jargon in your culture that comes from Freud. These are Freudian ideas, and there's some truth to some of them, but most of them are way overstated in my opinion. But they do stand for various aspects of human psychological behavior that might be of interest. So just be aware of that. What I do want to deal with briefly, this isn't strictly speaking philosophy, but it is interesting, and I think at least in the broader sense it can be useful. So this is a little bit of a detour, from philosophy, a little bit of psychology here that may be of interest. But Freud did a whole lot with what are called defense mechanisms. And what he meant by these were various ways that we psychologically defend ourselves from perceived threats. And these can be helpful, actually. There's something to it, and it's not a bad thing to understand and see it in yourself and see it in others. So anyway, some of these you've heard of, some of you may not have heard of. The first one, maybe the most famous, is called denial. Denial. Denial is not a river in Egypt, right? What is denial? Denial is, something bad. It's painful. And rather than facing it, you deny it. You take a philosophy test. You were hoping for an A-. You get a C-. You walk away. Yeah, grades don't matter anyway. Now that, my friend, is called denial. That is not healthy. That is a way of just taking this reality in your life and throwing it in the closet and just saying, I don't care anyway. It's sometimes called sour grapes, it just doesn't matter anyway. You ask somebody to go on a date, not that you do this, I realize, this never happens here, but someday or other, you decide you want to go out with some young lady, and you propose that you two go out for a, we used to call them a Whitworth a Coke date. You just kind of, have a little. And she says, "No way, man, never. I'm not going out with you in 100 years. Get out of my life." Then you go, "Well, I didn't care about her anyway." That's denial. All right. So kind of learn to recognize that. It will happen in your life, and it's what Freud called a defense mechanism. The next one is called reaction formation. Reaction formation. You get a C on a philosophy exam. Everybody in the room gets a C, except, of course, for Sydney, who gets an A. And you think to yourself, and then you say to yourself, she's not that smart. You see. Okay. Reaction formation is when you say the opposite of something. It's a little form of denial, but it has a little bit of a different spin to it. She's not that smart. She's just lucky, Once again, she just guessed, and got the right answer. So that's reaction formation. That's when you basically interpret a situation with precisely the opposite view of reality. Third one, displacement. Displacement is when you take your anger out on something that can't fight back. You get a C on a philosophy exam. You'd like to walk over and kick Mr. Gore, But you know that that's not good for your career. Even as seniors, you realize that that's not going to look good on the transcript. Broke leg of philosophy teacher, And so you go home and you kick the cat. That's displacement. That's when you go home and you punch the pillow. Mr. Gore. That's experience with this. I see that. Fourth one, Repression. Repression is when you have a traumatic experience. It can be a variety of types of experience. It's often sexual, but it's not restricted to that, but especially childhood sexual abuse is the classic example, but it's also the kind of thing, sometimes you'll experience guys that, have experiences in war, and it's a traumatic experience. It's painful, it's horrifying beyond anything of normal life, and so the mind goes into a kind of defensive mode in which that memory, that thought is repressed. And many times it can be repressed so successfully that the person actually forgets. The mind just forces it beneath the surface, and that's classic repression. I don't know if I mentioned to you, I had a client once. She came to me as about 28 years old. I was practicing, and she had been in counseling for about 6 months because her life had just been out of control. Did I tell you this story? I told it somewhere recently. You haven't heard this. Anyway, this is, so she came, very attractive young lady, but she just had a life that was out of control. She'd been in trouble. She came from a very respectable family. Her father was a pastor. It was just like you thought it was a picture-perfect Christian family, And at certain points, she just went, out of control. She was in trouble. She was out at night. She was just giving her parents, and they could not figure out why. They had several children, and she and they'd done everything they could. They had no idea. She was just a constant source of grief to them. And then when she was about 26 or 27, she finally realized herself that, what's wrong with me, kind of thing. She went to get counseling, and in the process of counseling, it came to light that there was an uncle that she had, and this happened when she was about 6 years old and he was about 17, and he'd raped her, And as that came, there were all these horrifying images. I mean, it's a ghastly picture, a scene. Don't try too hard to imagine, but it was ugly. And the blood, it was just all ugly, And it never came out, and she just slammed that memory right under the iceberg. It was at the bottom. And she didn't remember it. And of course, the 17-year-old uncle never knew it. And she'd gone for 10 years of just virtually being a basket case emotionally. And then finally, this whole thing came to light. And she was coming to me as, just as some of the legal aspects of this, but I was not a major player in the whole thing, but it was quite an interesting thing to behold. Now her trying to process this, and she did. And she processed it, It was very painful. I was with her. The counselor was with her on the day that this guy, who was now about 38, I guess, that she was able to confront him. He didn't deny it. It happened. It was for real. And it was quite a thing for her to express, to him what she'd been through. And for him to hear that, it was quite an event. She went on, after all that, went to school, was a psych major, went to graduate school, and now she's a PhD psychologist. She's, you talk about somebody who knows what it's like, and she deals with people who've been through experiences like this, and nobody can say to her, you don't know what it's like. She knows exactly what it's like, but she lost 10 years of her life because of what Freud called repression. That is, it's real, it does happen. The chances are pretty good that every one of us in this room are repressing something. It may or may not be anything as scary as that. I assume it probably isn't, but we all have memories of experiences that are somewhat traumatic, somewhat painful, whatever, and there's a tendency for the human mind to just push those things under the surface. Not that they're lost to you forever, but you just don't let your mind go there, you know. That's why people have the good old days. Sort of, you know, how everyone talks about the good old days. I feel that way. 20 years ago, that was really the good old days. Well, I'm forgetting all the bad stuff about 20 years ago. It actually wasn't such good old days back then. But once you've repressed all the bad stuff, all that's left to think about are the good things. And so it seems like, it was all good back then. Well, that's a little bit of repression. So anyway, that's repression. Yeah?
Are all these different stages that you go through, so you start with denial?
No, they're not. These are not in any particular order. Although it's a good thought, Jordan, and I think there may be a little bit of interaction among them. But it's not like these are stages along a process. Yeah. All right, next one. Projection. Projection is quite common. We all do it. Some people do it more than others. But projection is when you have a bad attitude, you have a bad perspective on something or some kind of malice, and rather than facing it in yourself, you interpret whoever you're dealing with as having that very same bad attitude. You know? You're selfish. Self-centered, and so you accuse Stephen, that guy is so selfish. You know. Whatever non-virtuous aspect of your character is sort of pressing you at the point of your consciousness, you push it on someone else, and that's called projection. And that's a term you'll hear. I've heard that in term used in movies and popular culture and so on. It's a pretty well known idea and fairly well established. So be careful. The Apostle Paul says in Galatians chapter 6, if your brother is overtaken in a fault, right? Remember that text? You who are spiritual, meaning walking with the Spirit, go to that brother in a spirit of humility, watching out for yourself, lest you be similarly tempted. You know, I think Paul understood something of this. I tend to be the most aware of faults in other people that are faults that I myself have. You see. And so if I see Spencer doing something that I don't think is right, the chances are pretty good. That's a point where I know that I have a tendency to have a problem. I tend to be blind to problems other people have that I don't deal with. They're kind of foreign to me. But I'm familiar with my own problems, and so I'm more sense. Like, you ever heard of, who are the most, who in this world are the people who are the most hostile to smoking? Answer? Besides Trevor, of course. Who are the people? The people you will meet in life who are the most hostile to smoking are...
Is it those kids that grow up and their parents smoke?
It could be. I think there's even one that beats that one.
That have quit smoking.
That's right. You'll never find somebody that hates smokers more than ex-smokers. It's kind of the same way with people who've had an alcohol problem, and then they get back, they stop drinking. Wow, they can sniff an alcoholic out in a room of 100 people. They just have a sixth sense about that, They know all of the games, all of the psychology. The point is, you will tend to be the most sensitive to faults in others that are your own faults. So when Paul says, if your brother is overtaken in a fault, I think Paul was aware, part of the reason you see that fault is because you probably have something of the same fault. So Paul says, go to that one, but watch out for yourself, you see, because you may be just projecting. You follow me? You could be, really seeing in that person. I keep pointing at Spencer because I was using him as an example. But it could be anyway, but you could just be seeing in that person your own difficulty. So again, I think Freud is helpful here. It's just good counsel, and I think in this case it's somewhat biblical counsel, even though Freud was the one who happened to say it in this case. But of course, Paul said it before Freud did, so we'll give Paul credit for that one. All right, next one is called Intellectualization. This is a really interesting one. Intellectualization is, by definition, pretending you are somewhere else during a painful experience. Pretending you're somewhere else. So you're going through some awful experience. Normally this would be an abusive experience or something that is, it's not like being in the doctor's office ordinarily, but it's something where it's, although that can be very abusive, I grant you that, but usually this is where you're being victimized, by somebody more powerful in some way or other. And one of the ways the mind will deal with that is called intellectualization, which is where you just take your mind to the beaches of Maui, or you take your mind to some place where it's safe and you just pretend you're there and kind of obscure or filter the stimulus of the present moment. That's called intellectualization. If it is severe, which it can be, again, in terms of abusive things, especially in childhood, it's documented that this often leads to multiple personality disorder, where you have a person who can get so good at getting to a different place that pretty soon that other place is as real to them as reality itself. And so usually when you meet people who've got that difficulty, and it isn't something like schizophrenia, which is that's, you can deal with that medically, but it's psychological in origins. That's going to be part of what happened. Intellectualization. Rationalization. Rationalizing, we all tend to do this. I do it. It's where you kind of justify a doubtful decision on illegitimate grounds. Mr. Gore, why are you eating the 14th chocolate chip cookie? I mean, one is fine, but 14? Well, the truth of the matter is because I'm a glutton. I have no self-control. I just see the cookie, I have to eat it. But I say to you, oh, well, I'm running an experiment. I'm doing a psychological analysis, you see. I'm going to write a paper for the New England Journal of Medicine. And I start giving you kind of specious justifications for my bad behavior, finding grounds which are pretty much irrelevant to try to explain why I'm doing this or that thing. That's rationalization. Compensation. Compensation is when you semi-consciously or semi-consciously take a different behavior because the behavior you might ordinarily take is already taken by someone else. I know that doesn't make any sense as I just said it, but the most famous example of this that does occur fairly interestingly, fairly predictably, is if you're in a family with multiple kids. Very often, not always, there's exceptions to this rule, but very often the firstborn kid is the straight arrow. Plays by the rules, does what's right, studious, obedient, conventional, just right down the middle, Mr. or Miss Straight Arrow, the firstborn. Well, the second-born shows up in the family, and early on, the second-born is saying, who am I? And begins to assess, in this family, well, I see the position of straight arrow, conventional, obedient is taken, so I'm going to have to be somebody else because I need to define myself in some sort of distinct way. And so oftentimes second-borns are rowdy, they get into trouble, they're always on the edge, they're pushing the rules, they're just a little bit more of a problem, a little more of a handful. Many times second-borns are a big surprise to the parents because the parents think to themselves naively, we got this parenting thing down. Look how nice Johnny is doing, our firstborn. No problem at all. So they say, let's have another one. Along comes the next one, and it's the kid from, they just, where'd this? How did the same genetic pool produce these two totally different kids, And so it can be quite a interesting thing. Well, that can take place in many settings besides family, although family is by far the most famous. So, second-born tend to be the ones that clown around. Anybody ever see the movie A River Runs Through It? Okay, that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. If you remember the two sons of a Presbyterian father, it's a perfect example of this. And I remember at the time, the pastor of the church that I was attending, the pastor's gone now, but he was a Presbyterian pastor and he had two sons. It was he said for days he was just living that movie because it was so descriptive of what he'd gone through in his own family. Firstborn son, solid, went to law school, respectable, doing fine. Second-born son, just constant grief, constantly giving him trouble. Although the second-born turned out okay as well. But anyway, that's compensation. Last one is called sublimation. Third-born, yeah, no. Dream on, pal. It only gets worse. Except in the case of Krista, of course. Yeah. Somebody's actually done quite an analysis of this, and there's something to it. You can't hang your hat on all the time. That firstborns tend to be a certain way, secondborns tend to be a third way, thirdborns, tend to have certain characteristics. Doesn't always hold out, but it's interesting. Sublimation is when you channel unacceptable impulses into acceptable behaviors. You channel unacceptable impulses into acceptable behaviors. You may recall in the video that we saw on Freud, those of you who were here, that actually one of the commentators on Freud's life talked about how he sublimated, his own impulses by pouring himself into his work. And that'd be a good example of it. You may have, Mr. Cheeley, we were just talking about you. Change the subject. Just kidding. Where are you in your family? What's your birth order? You're number 3. So let's see. That's right.
Let's still in the upper half.
Oh, that's right, because there's more. Yeah, okay. So, you know that all of us, as we go through our day, routinely have impulses that are unacceptable. They may be of a variety of kinds. We have impulses to say things or do things. And immediately something in us says, no, don't do that. Idiot, don't do that, And that's what Freud called your superego. It just kicks in so that if you didn't have that conscience, that superego, you would be constantly doing things highly inappropriate, and you'd probably get kicked out, within about a half an hour if we acted on every impulse that crosses our mind. It's part of our, we would say as Christians, part of our sin nature that we got this stuff going on. Freud, however, realized that we have these impulses, and he said, those impulses don't go away. It's not like you just kind of stop them cold, but they sort of divert. And so your impulse, which in itself would be unacceptable, gets redirected into a path which is socially acceptable. And so you might turn what was going to be a slanderous insult into a joke, or something like that. I think you all know what I'm talking about. We can play that game, and that's called sublimation. Sometimes people, and it's often been the case that, a guy might throw himself into his work because he would like to, let's say, be involved in a romantic relationship, get married and go that, but he's faced rejection enough times that he's just not going to put his ego out there anymore, and so he throws himself like into his work so that consumes him, and he's sublimating his desires elsewhere into this alternative behavior. So anyway, these are the most famous. There were some others Freud gave, but that's the 9 of those are the ones that have really stayed with us. You'll hear all of those terms used in popular culture. You'll hear them used in college classrooms, sometimes without explanation. The assumption is that you would know what these things are, and so now you do, you see. And so when you hear these things, you'll know what's going on. Questions about that? I've got one other little piece of Freudian stuff I want to talk about, but our hour's getting away from us, so we may just stay on this. Stephen, please go ahead.
I was wondering, did Freud have a specific term for somebody who convinces themselves that something else has happened? Like, if they got a C on a philosophy test, they convince themselves that they got an A or something like that? I thought about that as something that, like, I've seen TV shows and that kind of stuff, where somebody will insist that the opposite has happened of what actually occurred.
Well, I think he would probably include that as some form of denial. That would be what first would come to mind. Denial is where you actually deny that what has evidently happened really did happen, and that would be a way of doing it. I don't know if I ever told you that when I was in the 5th grade, did I ever tell you this? I must have. For the first time in my life, I actually, I'd always just been kind of easygoing as a student, never worked very hard and did okay. 5th grade, I took science, not from my 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Bottorff, who was a lovely, lovely woman and who liked me, but I took from the guy who came in just to teach science, whose name was Mr. Milhofer. Not such a nice guy. After the first quarter, he gave me a grade in science of, you ready for this? This is just our little secret. It's not going to leave this room, is it? He gave me the grade of F minus.
Mr. Gore. I didn't even know you needed plus or minus.
Very few people have the distinction in life of having gotten an F minus. I didn't do this now, but you know how tempted I was, don't you? Just to kind of... It would almost work, wouldn't it? I didn't do that. Well, I'm happy to say that when I went home and showed that report card with some degree of terror to my mommy and my daddy, they were not pleased. But they responded very well and helped me study much more. And the next quarter, second quarter, I got a B plus. So I really came up in the world, So that was nice. So anyway, Stephen, I don't know. I think that's probably where we put. Any other comments, questions, thoughts about this little defense mechanism? Yeah.
How do people figure out the repression one? How do people figure out what they've been pressing?
Usually it is going to be, repression is never fully successful. So there's always going to be some kind of point where that which is repressed is trying to express itself, and it may be in little odd behaviors you have or something like that. Ordinarily, if it's true repression, which is kind of taken on psychological proportions, many times it'll be in counseling, where as your counselor starts asking you questions, a good counselor notices that every time he or she asks you about, your experiences in the third grade, you kind of you get a little anxious, a little nervous, or asks you about your mother, or asks you about this or that. Notices where there seem to be forbidden areas. And whereas most polite conversation will sort of avoid those areas, a good counselor is saying, well, let's take a look at this. Let's kind of, open that door. That's what happened with my friend, that I was mentioning earlier. Just the counselor was very good and just kept gently pushing. And finally there was just this explosion. And she'd hit, the deal. And it was very painful and very emotional, but in the greater scheme of things, it worked out well. So that's that. That would be at least one. Thank you all. You bet.